value and valued knowledge. So I never go into a talk without reminding us to hold that in mind, that someone out there is using these metrics to tell us who is considered in school and who is considered out of school. So yes, it's entangled with past and present exercises of power. So when we get UNICEF and USA and DFID coming to run programs and tell us about children who are out of school, it's not innocent. It can come as an education for all agenda, it can come as SDG, but it's entangled with all sorts of power dynamics. And I think it's worth it to remember that all the times. Global discourses of development, and in turn, underdevelopment, as countries like mine tend to be seen as, and often an imaginary access to Western-style classrooms and knowledges. And that's why the system I study called Almajianchi is not considered school enough. It's that imaginary Western-style classroom. So if it doesn't fit, it doesn't quite work. This is what I mean by global. I've put in the word global. I found it very fascinating, and I've explained what I mean. It's where we take a global knowledge of whatever, but really try to situate it within the local. So it's a combination of global and local. Okay? So simultaneous occurrence of both academics and big English, right? Universalizing and particularizing tendencies. Look at that. I don't know who came up with that, but now, okay, that's a mouthful. So take of it what you may. This is Nigeria. It's in West Africa, for those of us who don't know. And I found a brother from Burkina Faso, which is up there. I imagine myself to be Burkinabe because my name, Kere, is not present anywhere in Nigeria except in Burkina Faso. Imagine that. So yes, and it's English-speaking, surrounded by by French-speaking countries. I just thought you should see a map so that when I talk about Nigeria, you know what I'm talking about. This is a history, and I'm not going to go into it, but I think it's important that you see what I'm talking about when I talk about Nigeria. Former British colony, so what that means is that we speak English. I've spoken English since the first day I went into a classroom. I've learned in English completely, and has a population of 200 million, give or take. That's a large number, and that's why we can have potentially 10 to 18 million children out of school. That's over a quarter of all children in Nigeria are not considered to be in school. Over 400 languages. So you see why English makes sense as a lingua franca. It means if I see other Nigerians here, chances of us speaking the same language are next to nothing. We have to speak in English. And so this is other things. Nigeria has the largest number of out-of-school children in the whole world. And there's a north-south divide in educational access. Nigeria is very complex. So if you're from the south of Nigeria, you consider yourself more educationally advanced. But what that means is that the British got to you first through the sea. And Western education is more predominant. If you're from the north, chances are that you would have an Islamic influence, hence the traditional Quranic schoolings, not considered as schools. And this is a breakdown. I'm happy to share my slides. I wouldn't want to go into it. But like I said, it's multilingual. And there are different entities in charge of education. That makes putting in place education policies really hard. And that really makes it complex from region to region, from states to states. There are 36 states. So you will see some figures from some states worse than in other states. So you know how I said I Googled just before I came on there at this slide. These are just some of the news between April to now. World Bank says Nigeria has the highest number of children out of school. UNICEF declares 18.5 out of school children in Nigeria. Some said it's 11 million out of school children rising. Again, these are the figures that come up again and again and again. So yes, a basket of challenges, as I call it. It's deep into crisis on many fronts. What has made it worse is that for the past 10 years at least, we've been dealing with terrorists in the northeast of Nigeria. In 2014, over 300 schoolgirls were kidnapped. Some of them have still not been found. Now, in the past year alone, over 2,000 school children have been kidnapped from schools. And hence the title of my presentation, which is, are they out of school or are they pushed out and jumped out? Because if the option is be in school and get kidnapped or stay at home, I know what I'll pick for my child. So these are some of, I'm beginning now to go into the nuances of why just seeing the numbers for out of school hides so many existing realities. Okay? Yes, this is what I mean about what do we actually mean. When I said this was in 2021, more than 600, but now we're easily 2,000. In my state alone, I went in March, and my sister and I, she's missing this, I can't believe she's missing this actually. Flown all the way from Abuja yesterday, got here and she's missing it. But we have a school, and when we...
Sorry, is she here?
She's here somewhere. No, I think she's gone for lunch, it is what it is. She was so touched, that, oh, there's time, she's going to go for lunch, but we thought there would be a presentation before me. We have a school, and the government schools, the public schools in our state had been closed. Yay, she's here!
Welcome.
Had been closed for like 6 months, no school whatsoever. Everyone was at home. The only schools that were open were private schools. Our mom is also an education teacher. She said, we have a school, and she said, you must consider closing your school in solidarity. The public officials will do nothing because their children are in private schools. It's the children of the masses who are not in school because of insecurity and everything else, and strikes and all that. So this is the nuanced nature. This is what I mean when I say children are kept out. They're not just out of school because of choice. They're kept out due to a myriad of reasons. So the question now is it just simply drop out? Kept out or actually even pushed out, depending on how you look at it. You know what I talked about, the granny schooling system with purportedly 10 million boys in the system who are then accused of being terrorists because Islam is often seen as a radicalizing influence in their lives? These are some of the images that you find when you check online. They are called al-Majri, and they are said to make up most of Nigeria's out-of-school figures because their school is not seen as a school. In actuality, this is how they'd like to be seen. Just in alternative forms of schooling, not necessarily learning in English, but learning nonetheless. This is what I do, and I'm not going to go into that. That slide should have come way before. And in essence, what I'm saying is that education ought to sit within the decolonial project. The way we analyze issues such as out of school also needs to sit within the context of what's happening in that particular country. It's not just enough to say, this number is out of school. It needs to, in some way, find a way of reflecting what that really means. Some other reasons besides being alternative forms of school, besides banditry and kidnapping and general insecurity, there's an opportunity cost for being in school. Nigeria says has a basic, universal basic education, so it's supposed to be till you get to secondary school age. School is meant to be, actually even the first 3 years of secondary is meant to be free, but that's not true. There are hidden costs. You have to pay for uniforms, you have to pay to get into school, you have to make sure your child is fed, maybe your child helps you in the farm or selling. So there's an opportunity cost for being in school, and a lot of people still can't make it to school. There's a diminishing value of return. You finish with a university degree, and there aren't jobs out there. With a country of 200 million, it's unsurprising. So people don't see the benefit. Like, you send your child to school, what does he come out with? What's there for him? And then gender issues, that's always present. With Nigeria, it's not so simple. Like, if I were to ask quickly, which gender do you think is most affected? No right answer, I'm just curious. Go on, someone.
Male.
Female? See, that's the thing. It depends on where you go again, because don't forget, the Almajiri are mostly all boys, right? So they account for most of it. But then when you go to some parts of the country, girls are not affected because of cultural reasons. Especially now, with them being kidnapped, who's going to send their child? Especially females who tend to be generally more protected. And like you say, people assume, oh, well, they're going to get married anyway. So why am I sending them to school? And then, not to talk of the north-south divide, and then the special educational needs aspect. That doesn't even It doesn't feature that children with additional needs are not catered for. They have to turn to private establishments. So if you have a child who has special needs, he's not captured in those figures at all. And you have to find the money to take them to alternative provisions. And then cultural factors like I've mentioned, and then education in a pandemic. We've just been through a pandemic. I've been listening to amazing presentations on the pandemic. It's still getting researched. We still are learning from that. How many units do I have? I always say this. Two. Oh wow, okay. Already I've estimated 10.2 million, 18 million if you believe some of the figures. We are still trying to uncover what the pandemic has done for our education system. Yeah, special education needs even worse. So we're still recovering from the devastating effects. Add insecurity, add corruption, add individual family factors, and you have truly a basket of challenges. Oh, so I got into the end, and I think why I framed my presentation like this is because I don't want anyone walking away thinking that just hearing about out-of-school figures is as simple as it is. It depends on the context, it depends on the parameters, it depends on what you call education, what you call schools, and several other factors. So yeah, it calls for a careful and critical analysis of several issues. So we must take care to look into nuance and complex nature of educational delivery and uptake, often in complex settings such as Nigeria. So I hope this gets you thinking about more things. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting insights. Now we'll go to our next session. It will be a very interesting one and insightful as well. First, I would like to ask if everyone from the presenters is here. So, Dr. Nasha Ayash, yes, thank you. And Muran Akuyun, thank you. And Dr. Simos Berlin, thank you. So we will start with navigating the schooling experiences of transgender persons in Pakistan, paving the way towards policy reform. Please, thank you.
Hello everybody, good afternoon. My name is Nasha Ejaz and I am from Pakistan. I'm teaching in a university there in the Department of Gender Studies. And when we talk about gender studies, it's a misconception that we only study and research women. We also do men and we also do transgender. So before I actually start on my presentation, I would like to just take a minute to explain what transgender is. I know most of you know it, but just for my sake. So transgender is anybody who is whose gender identity does not relate to the sex or genitals they are born with. For example, people whose sex or genitals are same as their gender, they are called cisgender people. And then anybody whose sexual identity or anybody whose genitals are different than their gender are transgender people. Transgender is a very broad term. We have many people, we have many terms under the umbrella of transgender. So my research focuses on schooling experiences of transgender persons in Pakistan and the problems they face and why they have to, or like she said, they're forced to step out of school or drop out from school in very early years of their schooling and the consequences they face. So this research, again, I don't need to read this. This was the definition of what transgender is. So anybody who does not believe they fit with a basic sex framework in which they are labeled either as a male or female is related to a transgender, is called a transgender person. Transgender community in Pakistan, like in many other parts of the world, is marginalized because they are minority, they are very few people, and underprivileged when it comes to their basic human rights, for example, education, health, and living. They are not safe. There are a lot of killings against them. They are tortured, humiliated, and sometimes murdered. A low level of education is one of the reasons that I found in my research. So this presentation is a very small part of my bigger project that I'm working on, which is overall their movement. There was a very progressive law that we got in Pakistan in 2018, which allows transgender people to self-identify. So they can just go to the government and tell them that they are transgender, and then the authorities have to register them as transgender people. This is a very progressive law in an Islamic context and in South Asian setting. So that is my broader project, but this is a very small part of it. We found that a low level of education is one of the reasons transgender persons in Pakistan have to resort to professions such as begging on streets, dancing in parties, and sex work. And all three of these professions are illegal in Pakistan, which makes them vulnerable. So when they are attacked or when they are victims to violence, they cannot even go to the police and report it because the settings the incidents take place are illegal. So this increases their vulnerability. My research question for this presentation is what are the school experiences of transgender persons, what problems they faced during their schooling, and if applicable, what were the reasons for their dropout of the schools. In this presentation, I also compare the experiences of transgender persons who could complete their school. So at least in Pakistan, school is still 10th standard and then there's college. So who completed their school and those who for some reasons were dropped out before completing their school. This is a qualitative research. I conducted in-depth interviews with 13 transgender persons in Pakistan. They were different age groups, different levels of education. 8 of them were registered as transgender women, 3 were transgender men, and 2 were non-binary. So they were not trans women or men, they were just X category. So coming to the findings, problems faced in school, when inquired about the problems they faced during their schools, one background fact not fact, but one background of the context is that in Pakistan, in mostly South Asia, but I can certainly say about Pakistan, is that when parents get to know transgender, okay, there is one thing as intersex, so a child born with genitals which are not very clear to identify or no genitals at all. This is 0.01% of people. Then comes transgender people. Intersex is a part of the bigger transgender umbrella, but the transgender people of my research, they were not born as transgender people, or at least when they were born, their parents didn't know that my kids are transgender. So when they grew up, their personality, their preferences, and their personality gave indication to their parents that okay, they are not cisgender. So when parents get to know this, they start to correct their children. They sometimes become violent, and when they know that they cannot be corrected, they, in most of the cases, disown them. So there are institutions, informal families of transgender persons. Their parents just disown them and send them to those communities. So there is a broader Khwaja community in Pakistan, which is the family of transgender persons. So what are the problems that transgender persons who were as children identified when they were in their identification stages, or when they were telling the world that they are transgender, the problems they faced in school was lack of acceptance, because they were not accepted. One, the forms just say man or woman. There is no transgender column to tick when they get admission in school. So when the children around them feel that this child is different than us, they don't accept them, leading to bullying, catcalling, and incidents of sexual violence at school, not only by their peers, but also sometimes by their teachers and school staff. And due to these reasons, and the reasons such as poverty, because when the parents don't own them, they don't have financial resources to continue their schooling, and the communities of transgender people, as I told you, they are begging and they are doing sex work and they are doing dancing. So these are not very, professions that don't bring much money. So because of poverty and because of disownership from family and because of relocation, so maybe a child was going to school, but when the parents found out that this is transgender and they're disowning the child, they have to relocate. They just go out of the house. So it's not dropping out from the school only, it's dropping out from the family house also. So these are the reasons why they dropped out. And the consequences, or when I compared the transgender persons who could complete their school and those who could not, I found out that transgender persons who completed school were more likely to enroll in college. So this is after school, they could continue their education because they were brave enough or braver than the others, or ready or experienced to face the world and tell and claim their identity and their space, and they were even going to universities. Whereas the transgender people, and they were also less vulnerable to violence and poverty, and they had less violent school experiences as compared to those who were dropped out of school at an early age or early stage. At the end, these are only recommendations from this part of my this data, is that we recommend to conduct for NGOs in Pakistan, because there are a lot of organizations who are working for betterment of transgender persons in Pakistan. We advise them and the state to conduct gender sensitization trainings of teachers and staff in school. And once they are trained and they know that transgender is not something to be corrected, rather they have to accept it. If the teachers and staff are trained enough, they can also train their students. And then monetary incentives, because poverty and lack of money was one of the biggest reasons came out from our data. So we recommend providing monetary incentives to schools who have transgender persons and they retain them. Also to parents who keep their transgender children at home with family and send them to school. And also to transgender students, for example, in college or in higher classes, to give them monetary incentives so that they can continue their school, college, and even universities. Thank you. And if you have any questions and comments, I'm here.
Thank you very much. Okay, for our next session, teacher Murat Akkoyun.
Did I say it right? Okay. Can you see the screen? Okay. Hello everyone. Let me first introduce myself. I'm an English teacher and also graduate students at Necmet Erbakan University. This will be my first conference and I'm a bit excited for this. Sorry for that. Okay, let's start. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to talk about investigation of the concept of school dropouts and studies. This is my table of contents. The aim of this study is to investigate the concept of school dropout and studies. As a research method, literature review method was taken, which is among the qualitative research methods, was taken as a basis. What's dropout? Dropout is one of the most striking problems in education system. It is growing and becoming increasingly global problem for countries. And now it is seen that lots of countries are making great efforts to get rid of this problem. Although there are many definitions about school dropout, in general, in short, or we can say that there is no clear definition of the concept of dropout. Dropping out of school is defined as the failure of the students to complete education level. He or she is in due to various negative reasons. Absenteeism, indifference to the lesson, increasing bad behavior are the symptoms of the dropout. There are many reasons why students drop out of the school, but when the studies about school dropouts are investigated, it is possible to examine its causes, its reasons in three different ways. One of them is school-related causes. In our country, pre-school is not compulsory, and there are no scientific studies to evaluate students' needs, interests, and skills in primary schools. In addition, there are no or insufficient fine arts and sports secondary schools arranged according to the students' needs, interests, and needs. For these reasons, students it's not surprising for us that students don't foster good feelings towards schools because they don't find interesting environments that satisfy their needs and attract their attention. And the next, relationship between the school principal and students is a crucial factor for dropout. Unfortunately, in our country, most of the students are afraid of school principals. School administration. It is observed that students who are afraid of the harsh and negative attitudes of the principals, when they are late to school, they don't prefer going to school that day because of their harsh and negative attitudes. And this situation is the same with the teachers, the relationship between teachers and students. For example, homework is indispensable in education systems. So let's think about the homework pressure. When students don't do their homework, they're afraid of being punished in front of their peers. So to avoid this, they don't prefer going to school that day again. Some of the schools are not interesting and not entertaining environments for students because there aren't enough social cultural activities for them. Instead of this, extreme and difficulty of the curriculum, the long duration of the lessons, forcing capacity of the students, and of course, success-oriented approach discourages the students to go to school. And the second reason is that family-related causes. You know, family is one of the most significant parts of education, because even a little problem that may occur in the family can affect a student's school life deeply. So family is important, you know. The socio-economic status of the family is one of the most important reasons for dropping out of school. When families don't have sufficient incomes, or when they have financial problems, unfortunately, they force their children to work instead of school at an early age. So this leads the students to keep away from school for a long time, and because of this, they drop out of the schools. Family history is effective in the emergence of tendency to drop out of school. There may be some undesirable situations, such as family divorce, family pressure, and bad behavior of the parents. And because of this, the students in this kind of situations show tendency to drop out of the school. They are not willing to come to school. And one of the most striking reasons is that child brides, early marriage, I think this is a big problem. And this situation arises due to reasons such as low educational level of families and poverty, especially poverty. As I have said before, when families have financial problems, or if they don't have sufficient incomes, in fact they have two options. One of them is to force their sons to work at an early age instead of school, and the second is that to force their daughters to get married at an early age for the bride price, for the sake of bride price, unfortunately. And the third reason is that individual-related causes, private personal problems negatively affect school careers, such as learning problems, lack of motivation, wrong choice of vocational education are determinant in school dropout. Students who don't have a good relationship with their friends and teachers, or who don't like the school, are unwilling to attend the school, and especially academic failure and the learning disability are the biggest obstacle to drop out of the school. One of the causes for dropping out of school is the health problems. If they get a disease that is difficult to treat or fatal, they have to drop out of school. For example, we had a student in my school. Unfortunately, he became cancer, and for this reason, he had to drop out of the school. Unfortunately. And consequences of dropout caused by many factors affect both individual and society in many ways, such as loss of time, waste of talent, unemployment, increase in crime rates, lack of self-confidence in young people, hopelessness for the future, and inability to raise consciousness citizens arise. And previous studies indicated that school dropouts lower the quality of education, damage the country's economy, increase social service expenditure, and cause more taxes to be collected from the citizens. How many students drop out of school in education system can give us some clues, some tips about the economic, social, and cultural conditions in that country. Depending on family factors, students' tendency to drop out of school increases as their relationships with their families weaken or family pressure increases. Regarding perceived reasons to drop out, economic problems, disallowing from going to school by the family, and academic failure is the biggest obstacle for school completion for all individuals. And for recommendation part, it's essential to arrange long-term education training programs such as guidance and counseling system for all education stakeholders. Principals, students, teachers, and of course families. For this reason, Ministry of National Education and Ministry of Family and Social Policies can cooperate on this issue to create a stress-free environment, a learning environment, and reduce and prevent the dropout of the students. And this research was carried out with qualitative research methods based on literature review. Different research can be carried out on the basis of interval-based qualitative research methods, as well as quantitative and mixed research methods. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Is there any questions or thoughts about this topic?
Yeah.
Okay. Please, Dr. Seamus Byrne. Thank you.
Okay, I might need someone's help with the language. And thank you for that, and also thank you, Chair, for the introduction. I'm going to follow on from a lot of kind of narrative that we've spoken about today, but my kind of presentation will have more of a legal lens, and I'm going to particularly focus on the rights of children, that is the internationally protected rights that they will enjoy under the Convention on the rights of the child, which every country in the world, except for the USA, have signed. So it's a treaty of international prominence, and it accords a broad array of particular and individual rights to all of the children right across the globe. They do not have to ask for those rights, they do not have to beg for those rights, they are entitled to those rights by virtue of their humanity. So what I'm going to do in this PowerPoint is I'm going to focus on the educational rights of children, special educational needs, or SEND for short, within an English context, and I'm going to frame the analysis in relation to the children who are excluded from school, which connects with the overarching theme of the conference, which is dropout. I'm going to start the paper with a quote from an Irish author who wrote an influential text which chronicled his life on the west coast of Ireland at a time in history when education was not publicly available in Ireland, and in particular when second-level education was not freely available either. Frank McCourt was an author of international prominence. He subsequently went to the USA, but his book Angela's Ashes, which was subsequently made into, I think, a film, is an excellent book. And one of the quotes which I've taken actually from the book, for me, encapsulates the transformative and emancipatory effect of education, that it can effectively lift people out of poverty and equip them with the skills to progress in life. And it does not matter whether you're poor or whether you're from a particular background, but actually being educated and having an equal right to education can equip you with the skills that will enable you to succeed in whatever aspect of life that you choose. And I want to first of all outline the right to education. It's resolutely anchored within the fabric and the text of international it's resolutely anchored within international law. From a children's perspective, the Convention on the Rights of the Child enshrines the right to education under Articles 28 and also under Articles 29. And as an international treaty, it is the only treaty that has two provisions dedicated to education. From a European analysis, there's also the ECHR, which is relevant also to Turkey, and the right to education is protected under Article 2, Protocol 1 of the ECHR. The right to education, I would argue, is uniquely triadic in its composition, and it encompasses the right to education, but also it provokes questions about how do you deliver the right, how do you give effect to the right to education domestically. When we speak of the right to education, it's important that we don't narrow the focus, but rather those that are the beneficiaries of education, principally children for the most part. They have a right to education, they possess rights when they are in education, and the education system should also develop the rights through education. So we talk about kind of curricular issues and things like that. When we talk about delivering the right to education, there's a very careful balance to be struck. And that involves the state, parents, and the child. And it's important that we do not overlook the rights of the child within that framework. And I was struck earlier by, I think one of the sentences from my colleague in Belgium, where she spoke about the student-focused nature of the right to education and how education surrounds the child. And that's a very important point, that when we speak of the right to education, we do not diminish or circumvent the rights of the child. So that's a brief overview of the right to education, and I just wanted to highlight that for some broader context. I'm interested in looking at the exclusion issue in England. And the first point I want to make is that under UK constitutional law, education law and policy is devolved to all of the 4 home areas of the United Kingdom. So education law and policy in Scotland is vastly different from education law and policy in Northern Ireland, and vastly different from education law and policy in England. And the issue from that is that children in different parts of the country will have different levels of protection under the law. And that raises a number of profound issues also, both in terms of the extent of legal coverage, but also the quality of the rights which children and young persons possess. Exclusion from school is rampant in England, and the consequences of an exclusion from school are enduring, disproportionately negative, and they effectively consign children to an educational and social hinterland that's inhospitable. When we delve deeper into the statistics and we do a deep dive into the data, we're confronted with very uncomfortable facts. And the facts are that children with special educational needs are 7 times more unlikely to be removed from school than their non-SEN peers. Black boys, 3 times more likely to be kicked out of school. Children from Irish traveller or from a gypsy heritage, background, up to 4 times more likely to be removed from school. And also, children in poverty, 4 times more likely to be removed from school. That's an analysis of all of the variables on a single issue analysis. When those issues intersect with each other and we adopt an intersectional analysis, so we look perhaps at black boys with special educational needs, their educational prospects are severely diminished. So we know from the data that children with special educational needs disproportionately and statistically more probably to be removed from school than their non-SEN peers. So what are the figures in relation to this? Well, the most recent governmental figures from the period of last year, which actually covers the lockdown period. So we have to take these figures with a health warning, in that during the compilation of these figures, schools were closed for large parts of the academic year in England. But we know from the figures that there was 5,100 permanent removals of school. That means that just over 5,000 kids were permanently kicked out of school in England. That means they were deleted from the register of the school and had to be educated elsewhere. What the figures do not tell us is whether those 5,000 kids were actually educated elsewhere. We had over 310,000 fixed-term exclusions. That means an exclusion up to 45 days in a given academic year, which works out at about half of the academic year. Children with SEND, with special educational needs, occupy a very perilous position. They have the unenviable position of enjoying the highest grades. So they are disproportionately removed from school. And when we break down the figures even more, we know that amongst the children with SEND, or special educational needs, out of that cohort, children with emotional, social and mental health issues are the highest of that particular cohort. And following on from what my colleague spoke about earlier, that also raises the issue of access to health. Because when we speak about children with emotional, social and health issues, and we ask the question, why are they being kicked out of school? Why are they, by virtue of their health issues, being disproportionately removed from school? Then we have to ask the further question, well, are their health needs being provided for? And sadly, in the UK and in England, the evidence would tell us that they are actually not being provided for. So therefore, when they go into school, there's an episode which involves behavioural breakdown. Is that because of there being, on the one hand, perhaps they're being truant, but on the other hand, is there an unmet health issue there that's not being catered for by the state? And that brings me on to the legal kind of parameters within which the state is allowed to remove children from school. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the law, but I just wanted to outline the 4 principal legal areas which allow the state to remove children from school. Primary legislation is under the Education Act 2002. That is supported by the 2012 statutory regulations. And head teachers, before they exclude a child, have to have regard to the statutory guide from the Department of Education. Children with disabilities, which is particularly pertinent for those with special educational needs, have further protection under the Equality Act from 2010, which basically states that you cannot be discriminated on the basis of your disability. That's one of the protected areas. I should say, however, children in Northern Ireland do not have the benefit of the Equality Act 2010. There is no freestanding Equality Act in Northern Ireland, so we have to be conscious of the internal differences when we talk about the legal coverage of the law in the United Kingdom. Before a school can remove you, the decision has to be fair, has to be proportionate, it has to be reasonable, and it has to be a decision which is taken as a last resort. It should not be a decision that's taken at first instance, but has to be after all other avenues have been exhausted. And it must be for serious and persistent breaches of the disciplinary code. It can't be for minor, trifling issues, but for serious and persistent breaches of the code. And just to give you some anecdotal, a study I carried out a number of years ago in the northeast of England, where I spoke to children and a group of young persons, up to 80 children, where a lot of them were removed from school for hair dye, for having like nail polish and things like that. I mean, that brings into question whether the exclusion framework is being used in a lawful manner. So children with special educational needs. As I said, the evidence is overwhelming. We've had a succession of governmental reports. We've had an avalanche of investigations, and all of them are very clear. They're unambiguous in the fact that children with SEND are disproportionately more susceptible to exclusion than their non-SEN peers. So what are the consequences of that? Well, we know it from our earlier papers. An exclusion from school also will generate a retreat from society at large. Under attainment, there will be social affection, creating that distance between the child and the labour market. And we also know from evidence that it will accelerate their entry into juvenile offending and ultimately into the criminal justice system and when they're adults. But that is the legal framework, and it's important also that I outline the fact that in England we have a parallel system, an unacceptable parallel system where children are routinely illegally kicked out of school, where no record is kept by the school, no record is maintained by the local council, and where schools and principals and head teachers are actively ringing parents and telling them, collect your child at lunchtime and bring them home. That is illegal under the law, but that illegality has also been documented by the government. It has been documented by Ofsted, which is the state body responsible for overseeing and monitoring the education of children, and it has also been documented by a cross-parliamentary select committee on education. So the state know that children with special educational needs and others are being illegally deprived and denied the right to education. And we must also contextualise that within the broader culture of consumerism, competition, and neoliberal policies which has embedded itself within the delivery of education in the United Kingdom generally, but in England specifically. We have a landscape of league tables where schools are judged and they're ranked according to particular results. And it is on that basis where schools, eager to maintain their positioning on the table, will what we call off-roll other students who perhaps are not going to get the A, the B, or the C in English, math, and science. So we have to be conscious also that whether children are being excluded from school, or as the former speaker said, are being pushed out, kept out, or in fact deliberately designed out of education. So those are some of the issues which persist for children with special education needs in England. And in my analysis, from a legal perspective, that generates a lot of anomalies from a children's perspective. That's a children's rights perspective. The first is children have a right to have their best interest taken as a primary consideration under international law. That's enshrined in Article 3 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which says that decision makers, which include schools and the principals and the board of governors, must take account of what's in the best interest of the child. The law in England does not give effect to that principle. That principle is absent from education law and policy. If we take health law and policy that in England, then there is inclusion of the principle, but for education law and policy, the principle is absent. Article 12 of the Convention says that children have a right to have their opinions heard, and they have the right to ventilate their opinions on issues which are of direct concern. I cannot think of anything more pressing than your education being of direct concern to you, and particularly when you're facing the prospect of being excluded from school. Under English law, children do not have the right to appeal an exclusion. They only have that right when they reach 18 years of age, by which time they are out of education, so the right is ineffective. It's really a non-right. So I think that the law should be changed to give effect to those two principles. More widely, I think there's a real urgency for more concerted intersectional understandings of school, both kind of dropout on its own, but exclusion also. We cannot continue with the singular variable kind of definitions or the singular variable approach to our understandings. We do know what singular cohorts are more susceptible than others. We now need to get an understanding of how they intersect in with each other. And I think we should be adopting also a more rights-based approach to education, which also gives effect to the rights of the child when they are in education. And one of the very first general comments which the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child gave back in the early 90s was on the aims of education. And the UN Committee are the body charged with overseeing the implementation of the Convention. And the very first thing that they said in their general comment was that children do not lose their rights when they pass into school. So when they go over the school gate or into the school itself, when they cross the threshold of the school building, they do not lose their right. If anything, we should be mindful that their right should be amplified. And we also have to have regard to more inclusive approaches to education, both under the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but also the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities also. And what are the legal benefits that gives to children with special educational needs, but also what are the obligations that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities imposes on the state as well, and how can we hold the state to account. And I'm just going to conclude. I started off, the paper was a quote from an Irish author, the late Frank Court, and I'm going to conclude by a little quote from a very well-known poet, the late Seamus Heaney, who spoke about the importance of hope. And I think when we're having these conversations around education, dropout, educational disaffection, educational exclusion, for a lot of children who are the victims of a lot of these practices, you know, they do lose hope. They are being routinely denied the right to education. We should be holding people to account, you know, for those breaches. And I think hope is a really important, it's a really important thing that we should be mindful of as well. So I'm going to leave it there, and my thanks to the chair and my thanks to my colleagues for helping me with this presentation. Look forward to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will take a 15-minute break and continue with the next session.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Me too.